In the vast landscape of American music, one name rises above the dust, the miles, and the passing years. George Strait, a man whose voice didn't just shape country music, it shaped the heartbeat of a nation. For nearly half a century, his songs have drifted across open highways, filtered through kitchen windows at supper time, and echoed through the quiet corners where ordinary lives unfold. Amarillo by morning, a troubadour, each check yes or no, these not just melodies. They are memories, stitched into the fabric of America itself. But the story of George Strait begins far from the spotlight in the rugged soil of a Texas ranch where hardship came early. The silence left behind when his mother walked away carved a wound that could have closed a young heart forever. Instead, it forged a spirit of uncommon strength, a resilience that carried him from those dusty fields to the towering stages where legends are made. Yet even as his star ascended, shadows trailed close behind. George's journey would be marked by staggering loss, loved ones taken in moments that cut deeper than fame could ever heal. They were the kind of blows that would break most people, the kind that echo long after the applause fades. But time and again, he rose, turning pain into poetry, heartbreak into harmony, and personal tragedy into the very songs that helped millions find comfort in their own darkest hours. Now, at 73, as many believed he had finally stepped into a well-earned season of peace, a new chapter has stirred concern across the country. Reports of George's own health struggles and the quiet, private battles faced by Norma, his partner of more than 50 years, have reminded fans just how fragile even our strongest heroes can be. For those who have held his music close for decades, these moments feel personal, like worries for a member of the family. Before we begin this journey through the life of a man who gave everything to his craft and to his country, take a moment to honor George Strait, the king who never needed a crown, the troubadour who turned every trial into timeless music, and the enduring heart of American song. George Strait fans, take a breath, because this moment truly caught everyone off guard. The king of country himself has saddled up once again, teaming with the incredible Chris Stapleton for a massive 2025 stadium tour. But during the very first stop in Philadelphia, something unexpected happened. Something that instantly sent a wave of concern through the crowd. Mid-performance, George eased himself into a seat on stage, explaining with a gentle smile that his back had suddenly tightened up. The TikTok creator who shared the moment wrote, "But George said his back gave out and he won't be able to move around like he usually does." Even though George delivered the update with his trademark humor, fans felt their hearts sink. The comment section filled with worry and love. Cool. Messages like, "A praying he feels better soon," and "Oh, sweet George, you're doing an amazing job. I hope your back is okay," captured the devotion people have carried for him over decades. And the truth is, even though he stepped on stage less often over the last several years, George Strait still knows how to command a stadium like no one else. His voice, his presence, everything about him makes it clear how deeply he treasures performing. But as these recent back troubles surface, fans are starting to wonder, how much longer can he keep going? How long will he choose to? And as it turns out, George recently opened up with a surprisingly candid answer. And then, in a moment that felt almost suspended in time, George shared something raw. Something that instantly tightened every heart in the arena. "I've maybe got 5 good years left to sing these songs for you," he told the crowd, his voice steady but filled with a quiet honesty. What goodness, it's already been close to 50 years. He paused, soaking in the ocean of faces looking back at him. And I still love it, just as much as I ever did. When I walk through those curtains and see all your smiling faces, my feet don't touch the ground again until I head back out and climb on that bus. I don't know how many more years I can keep doing this. I figure a few. Those words didn't just echo through the stadium. They landed with the weight of reality. The fans who have walked through decades of music with him felt the truth in their bones. It's never easy hearing a legend speak about time, especially one as humble and dedicated as George Strait. That humility, that honesty, is part of what makes him such a rare treasure in country music. Because when George steps onto a stage, no matter the city, no matter the year, something extraordinary happens. His presence turns a simple night out into a memory people carry for the rest of their lives. All we can hope now is that he takes the time, the rest, and the care he needs so that he can keep performing on his terms. Because artists like George Strait aren't just performers, they're once-in-a-lifetime gifts. And, truthfully, none of us are ready to imagine a world where he's no longer up there, under those bright lights, singing the songs that have shaped generations. Every legend carries a moment that doesn't just shake their world, it divides it. A moment so sharp, so unforgiving, that it follows them like a shadow from that day forward. And for George Strait, that shadow began long before the bright lights, long before the arenas, long before country music ever knew his name. George Harvey Strait was born on May 18, 1952, in the small South Texas town of Podet. But it was in Pearsall, in a weather-beaten house and across the rugged, windswept ranchland near Big Wells, where the story of who he truly was began to take shape. His father, John Byron Strait Sr., spent his days balancing two demanding worlds, the chalk-covered lessons of his classroom and the relentless work of the ranch. Each required grit, patience, and quiet strength. Qualities he handed down to his sons without ever needing to say a word. George would later describe the land as honest but harsh, a place that didn't bend for anyone. Under that wide Texas sky, the sun didn't ease up, the dirt didn't soften, and a boy learned early that life was something you worked for. Not something handed to you. By the time George was 10, the rhythm of ranch life had already settled deep in his bones. The sharp bite of cold morning air, the groan of leather saddles, and the unspoken truth that a child often grows into their strength long before they understand it. But then came the moment that changed everything. The kind of moment that leaves a mark no spotlight can erase. George was just 9 years old when the tension inside their home, which had long simmered beneath the surface, finally broke. He would one day describe a silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something ending, and then it did. His mother gathered a single bag, gently took young Pensy by the hand, and walked through the doorway. The hinges released a weary groan as the door closed behind them, a sound George later admitted never truly faded from his memory. Beside him, his brother Buddy stood frozen, jaw tight, trying to be stronger than any child should ever have to be. It wasn't just someone leaving. It was the sudden loss of comfort, the absence of the voice that had soothed him, the warmth that had steadied him, all gone in an instant, too painful for a child to understand. And for the rest of his life, George Strait never spoke publicly about that day. Not once. But those who truly knew George would later say that day changed him forever. It altered the way he moved through the world, tightening his silence, sharpening his discipline, and carving into him that steady, unshakable calm he'd become known for. From that moment on, it wasn't just a household. It was 3 straight men, a father and 2 young boys, trying to hold together a world that had fallen apart without warning. And when that door closed, ranch life didn't simply return to normal. It tightened, closing around them like a V's. Without a mother in the home, and with a father who refused to remarry out of pride, duty, and perhaps heartbreak, the weight of responsibility settled heavily onto all 3 of their shoulders. There was no room for softness, no time to fall apart. George would one day admit that he learned what loneliness truly felt like, not by being alone, but by standing in the middle of a family full of hurt, where no one knew how to speak it out loud. Those mornings felt colder than before. Even the bright Texas sun couldn't fill the quiet space his mother once warmed. George's hands blistered as he patched fences. His young shoulders ached from pushing cattle across miles of sun-baked land. Nights at the small wooden table were filled with silence so sharp it felt like it could splinter. But his father became the pillar they anchored themselves to. George watched him step off the school bus in his teaching clothes, dust still clinging to him, only to change boots at the door and head straight out for another full shift on the ranch. There were no speeches, no explanations. George learned by witnessing. Strength, he discovered, wasn't loud. It wasn't bold, it was endurance, quiet, steady, unwavering. And through all of it, Buddy was right there beside him. A brother who carried half the weight without ever needing to be asked. The one who seemed to understand the ache underneath George's quiet because he carried the same ache himself. Yet beneath all the exhaustion, beneath the silence and the grit of those long days, something gentle began to grow inside him. Something fragile, glowing, impossible to ignore. Music, a calling he couldn't name then, but one that was already stitching itself into his bones, waiting for the moment it would rise. By his teenage years, George found himself drifting into a small garage band called the Stoics, chasing the spark of rock music and the wonder that groups like the Beatles stirred in young hearts. Back then, he didn't listen to country radio. He once said it felt too close to home, too tangled with memories he wasn't ready to face. Instead, he tuned into the Farmer's Report, steady voices speaking the language of rural life, filling the house with something familiar when everything else felt a little too empty. But destiny always knows when to knock. One night, inside a Texas dance hall bathed in flickering neon light, George heard country music in a way he never had before. Not as a song, but as truth. The stomp of cowboy boots across a worn wooden floor, the cry of a fiddle slicing through the air, the trembling ache of a steel guitar. It was as if someone had finally put sound to the feelings he had spent his whole life carrying in silence. And in that moment, something rose inside him. Something quiet, something certain. He didn't yet know where it would lead or how far it would take him. But the road had already begun forming beneath his feet, carved from heartache, shaped by long days of labor, held together by a father's sacrifice and a brother's loyalty, and guided by a voice waiting patiently for its moment to be heard. Surviving the pain of a broken home was one thing. But stepping into adulthood with nothing except a soft voice, a stubborn dream, and a world that didn't seem ready to make room for either. That was a different kind of hardship altogether. When George Strait returned home from the Army in 1975, at just 23 years old, he came back with discipline etched into his posture, but no clear path forward. Texas did not greet him with comfort or certainty. In 1976, he enrolled at Southwest Texas State University to study agriculture, choosing a practical path because chasing hope felt too dangerous, too fragile at the time. Money was painfully scarce. Most weeks, he survived on whatever he could stretch day after day. Canned beans, cheap bread so hard it scraped the inside of his mouth. Ramen noodles divided carefully into 2 small meals. His tiny San Marcos apartment turned bitterly cold in the winter, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones and reminds you just how close you are to falling through the cracks. The walls of that little San Marcos apartment seemed to breathe cold. On winter nights, George slept with his jacket zipped tight, watching his own breath drift into the air like a ghostly reminder of how thin the line was between holding on and falling apart. Years later, he would quietly admit, those years, they didn't just test me, they almost broke me. And yet, in the middle of that cold, that hunger, that uncertainty, something small and stubborn continued to glow inside him. That tiny ember pulled his eyes to a faded curling flyer pinned to a campus bulletin board. Stony Ridge looking for a singer. It felt like a long shot, but long shots were the only chances George had ever learned to take. He walked into a dim garage that smelled of motor oil, dust, stale beer, and amplifiers on their last breath. When he opened his mouth to sing, it wasn't bravado that filled the room. It was honesty, plain, unpolished, and real. And sometimes honesty is enough. It was enough for them. Soon after, they became ace in the hole. From 1976 to 1979, they fought through a grind so ruthless it would have crushed most men. Night after night, they played in honky-tonks choking with cigarette smoke. Smoke on floors sticky with spilled drinks in front of crowds who were more interested in their own arguments than the music happening on stage. And the miles, endless Texas highways rolling beneath a van that rattled with every bump, sounding like it could collapse at any moment. Some nights the band slept inside, that van, curling beneath thin jackets, balling up shirts as makeshift pillows, because a motel room, that was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. George would later confess quietly, there were nights I wasn't sure if anyone would ever really hear me. But as grueling as those roads were, they were nothing compared to the coldness waiting in Nashville. From 1977 to 1980, George carried demo tapes door to door, knocking on office after office, only to have doors cracked open, just long enough to be shut in his face. Executives brushed him off without a second glance. He wasn't unmarketable. He was too old-fashioned. He didn't look the part. And then came the harshest cut of all. One executive looked him in the eye and said, "Son, what you do belongs in the past." For a man who carried wounds he never spoke of, wounds from childhood, from silence, from loss, each rejection was more than disappointment. It was another strike at a dream already held together by thread. By late 1980, completely broke, exhausted, and worn down to the bone, George Strait found himself standing at the very edge, unsure if he could keep holding on to a dream that seemed determined to slip away. After one especially low-paying gig, one of those nights played beneath fading neon lights that buzzed like they were exhaling their final breath, George quietly unstrapped his guitar. He set it gently on a cold metal folding chair, stared at it for a long moment, and whispered into the empty room, "I'm done." There was no anger in his voice, no drama, just a man drained of everything except exhaustion. He accepted a job designing cattle pens, not because he wanted it, but because surrender felt safer than hope. It was the lowest valley of his life, a place where dreams don't explode. They freeze slowly until they slip away unnoticed. But fate doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes in the form of someone who simply refuses to let you fall. Norma, his wife, his anchor. This saw the quiet hollow that disappointment had carved into him. One evening, as the weight of his failures pressed down hardest, she looked at him with a steadiness powerful enough to pull a man back from the edge. And she said, "Give it one more year, George. Just one more." That single sentence, soft but unwavering, became the spark that pulled him out of the darkness. Those 4 words carried him straight into the office of Irv Woolsey, a former Macy executive who heard in George something Nashville had been too blind, too distracted, or too narrow-minded to recognize. Woolsey believed in him, and sometimes belief is its own kind of miracle. Because Woolsey believed, Métier cracked open one final door. Not a contract, not a promise, just a test. One song, one chance. One last breath before the dream died completely. The song was Unwound. And what happened next wasn't just success, it was transformation. When Unwound released in 1981, George kept his expectations low. He had learned to protect himself from disappointment. Then the song began to climb. Slowly at first, then faster. Then faster. And when it reached number 6 on the charts, something shifted in the air. The world finally heard him. And in that moment, all the bitter winters in that cold apartment, all the nights sleeping in the van, all the rejection, the rattling highways, the hunger, the doubt, the years spent wondering whether he mattered. All of it combusted into a single blinding burst of triumph. That one song lit the fuse that would launch a worn-down ranch kid toward a destiny carved into American history. A destiny that would one day crown him with a title no one has ever worn better, the King of Country. Because when Unwound hit number 6 in 1981, it didn't just lift a career, it shattered the walls George Strait had been pounding against with bruised knuckles for nearly a decade. That first breakthrough felt like a flare tearing through years of darkness. It illuminated everything he had crawled through to get there. Those freezing rented rooms where he slept with his coat pulled tight around his shoulders, the nights curled in the back of a worn-out van rattling down lonely West Texas highways, the cheap meals swallowed only to quiet the hollow ache, and the rejections sharp enough to bruise a man's spirit. Suddenly, the boy from that fractured Texas ranch, the young soldier who once sat staring at cattle pen blueprints, convincing himself that maybe that was all life had left for him, found himself standing at the doorstep of a dream he had always been told belonged to other men. But when that door finally opened, just barely, the wind on the other side hit with the force of a storm. Once a full-hearted memory shot to number 1 in 1982, the pressure around him tightened like iron wire. Nashville demanded hit after hit without pause. Radio wanted him everywhere at once, never caring if he'd slept. And the crowds he adored, with all his heart, expected a level of perfection that could swallow even the strongest performer whole. He crossed so many highways that there were mornings he woke up in a hotel room with no idea what state he was in. He sang through fevers, through dizziness, through nights when his throat felt scraped raw. Years later, in one of his rare open moments, he admitted softly, "For those years, I held on by grit more than anything else." The applause lifted him up. But the silence afterward, the moments alone in dressing rooms, in hotel beds, in long drives between shows, carried a weight no spotlight could ever soften. As the late 80s spilled into the 90s, George wasn't rising anymore. He was reigning. Platinum albums became so frequent they almost felt normal. Stadiums overflowed before posters had even been taped to the walls. His legendary 360-degree stage design drew crowds so massive they moved like living oceans beneath the lights. Yet behind the curtain, the toll carved deeper every year. There were nights he stepped off stage with his hands trembling so violently he needed both palms wrapped around a single cup of water just to keep it from spilling. Mornings when his spine burned as if someone had run a hot wire straight through it. The world saw the king on stage, but only a few ever glimpsed the man fighting to hold himself together behind it. In those long, exhausting afternoons, he pushed himself through rehearsal even when every part of him begged for rest. Calling it off just wasn't in his nature. Later, he admitted quietly that there were days he truly wasn't sure whether his body would carry him through. Meanwhile, the world around him shifted. Nashville leaned toward a glossier, pop-polished sound, drifting far from the roots he held dear. Critics labeled him too traditional, too pure, too firmly planted in the past. And all that pressure, spoken and unspoken, gathered above him like a slow-moving storm cloud. Then, in 1999, the sky finally split. He and Alan Jackson released a Murder on Music Row, a song that struck like lightning. The industry trembled. Supporters lifted him up as one of the last true guardians of country music's soul. Detractors rolled their eyes, insisting he was refusing to change with the times. George didn't argue with either side. He didn't have to. His silence carried more weight than any interview ever could, and still, the crowds only grew. His festival tours transformed entire cities into rolling oceans of denim, dust, and devotion. Then came 2014. The Cowboy Rides Away tour roared into AT&T Stadium, and 104,093 fans rose to their feet as one, marking the largest indoor concert in American history at the time. It looked like pure magic from the outside, but backstage, the truth was quieter and far heavier. That night, he sank onto a simple folding chair, shoulders curved, elbows resting against his knees. His breaths came shallow, the kind a man takes when he's holding himself together by the thinnest of threads. His lower back burned with heat. Suddenly, the conversation filled message boards and comment sections. Disappointment from some, confusion from others who struggled to reconcile it with the man who cherished the land he grew up on. Through all of it, George responded the only way he knew how, with a silence born not of stubbornness, but of reflection. Those closest to him say he would sit alone sometimes, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor, listening to the criticism more deeply than the public ever understood. "I'm no saint," he murmured once to a longtime bandmate. "I'm just trying to live honest." To him, character wasn't proven by shouting back or by winning an argument. It was proven by how a man carried himself when the world suddenly grew loud around him. And then came 2025. Not a rumor, not a quiet bit of disappointment, but a shock that cut straight through the heart of Texas. When George announced a major tour that, due to unavoidable scheduling constraints, didn't include a single stop in his home state, the reaction wasn't mild. It wasn't irritation, it was heartbreak, sharp, immediate, and deeply personal. Fans felt blindsided, as if a door they believed would always remain open had swung shut without warning. For so many, Texas wasn't just the place he came from. It was part of the bond between artist and audience, a promise threaded through decades of songs, memories, and miles and miles. And in that moment, millions felt that promise tremble. Some fans said the announcement felt like being left behind. Others said it felt as though the man who had once carried their stories in his voice had suddenly risen just out of reach. Why not us? They asked. Why not home? Why not home? The tension tightened like a pulled wire, not out of anger, but out of devotion. A devotion so deep that when stretched too far, it could sting in ways words could never fully explain. And behind all that uproar, behind the headlines and the message board storms, George felt the weight of it himself. Those close to him recall a night when he sat alone in a dim dressing room, the brim of his hat turning slowly between his fingers as he whispered, barely loud enough to be heard, "I never meant to let home down." But he also knew, with the kind of heaviness only years and hard-earned wisdom can teach, that not even legends can stand on every stage where their names are called. Life demands choices, calendars, closed doors, and even the strongest bodies have limits. So he met the moment in the only way he ever felt was right, with silence, with steadiness, with the quiet burden of disappointment carried without complaint. He trusted that time. Not explanations, not press releases would mend what distance had strained. And in the end, those controversies, sharp and sudden and entirely uninvited, did nothing to dim George Strait's legacy. If anything, they revealed its truest core. They showed that greatness doesn't protect a man from judgment. It simply shows the world how he stands when the judgment arrives. And for the fans who looked beyond the noise, a deeper truth settled in. A man is not extraordinary because he avoids every misstep. He becomes extraordinary because he meets criticism without bitterness, pressure without breaking, and expectation without pretending to be anything other than who he is. George Strait never claimed perfection. He never needed to. What he offered, unwaveringly and without theatrics, was sincerity. And in a world drowning in outrage and endless clamor, sometimes the legacy that endures is not shaped by the loudest voice, but by the man who stays true, steady, and quietly honorable decade after decade. Some storms in a man's life can be faced with nothing but grit and stubborn strength. But then there are the storms that come so hard, so unyielding, that only the right hand holding on beside him keeps him standing. For George Strait, that steady hand has always belonged to Norma Voss, the first girl he ever cared for, the quiet anchor who never once drifted from his side. The one constant, long before the world ever knew his name. Before the crowds, before the spotlights, before the titles and the record-breaking years, they were simply two shy Texas kids. Two teenagers sharing milkshakes they could barely afford, riding around in old pickup trucks as the warm evening wind tangled their hair. They whispered dreams so gentle and hopeful that you could almost cup them in your hands. And then, in 1971, hardly more than children themselves, they crossed into Mexico and got married. Just 19 years old, standing on shaky legs but holding a promise spoken straight from the heart. They had no idea how fiercely life would test them or how much strength those early vows would require. The trials didn't wait. When George enlisted and received his orders for Hawaii, Norma gathered their entire life into two worn suitcases and followed him with a quiet bravery she hadn't yet discovered in her. They lived in tiny, overheated apartments where groceries were carefully counted, where every dollar stretched into hope for the next day. Dinners were simple, sometimes nothing more than yesterday's leftovers warmed again, but shared with soft laughter in dim kitchens. They argued in hushed voices in narrow hallways, made up with shy smiles, and fell asleep beneath thin blankets as old ceiling fans clattered like tired machinery above them. And years later, George would look back on those days with a trembling honesty and say, "If she hadn't gone with me, I don't know who I would have become." Then came 1972, and with it, their daughter Jennifer, a light so bright it filled their little apartment like morning sun. Tiny socks draped over chairbacks, lullaby sung a little off-key, and slow, quiet mornings where the three of them felt like the smallest, happiest kingdom on earth. When George came home from the army and began chasing music with every ounce of strength he had, Norma walked straight into a different kind of storm. This one didn't howl or tear roofs from houses. It settled quietly, slowly, like a weight you almost don't notice until it's too heavy to lift. It was the quiet ache of loving a man whose dream demanded far more than any dream ever should. Some nights, long after dinner had cooled on the plates, Norma sat alone at the kitchen table, listening to the clock tick, its steady rhythm through the stillness. While George was miles away, playing in smoke-filled bars and small venues where no one yet knew his name, Norma kept the little world they shared from falling apart. She folded laundry in silence, paid bills that stretched too thin, and picked up toys from floors George hardly stepped on anymore. The road took him, the loneliness took her, and still she stayed. Years later, George would speak a truth he carried quietly inside him, almost like a bruise that never fully faded. "I wasn't home enough."
I wasn't home enough.
She took on more than anyone ever knew. And she had, without complaint, without applause, without asking for anything in return. In the middle of that tiredness and strain, life gave them a small, gentle light. In 1981, their son, George Harvey Strait Jr., Bubba, arrived. It was like someone opened a window in a house that had been dim for too long, letting fresh air and sunlight spill back in. Norma held that baby with the strength of a woman who had carried her family through years of quiet battles. And George, worn down from long nights and endless miles, looked into his son's face as if seeing a chance to rebuild, to soften, to breathe. He would later say, "Ibi Baba brought something back into the house we thought we'd lost." And in that simple confession lived all the hope they poured into raising him. There were late-night feedings, little boots lined up by the front door, and afternoons where George taught Bubba how to sit a saddle, his big hand steadying his son's small ones. In those moments, their home felt alive again, held together by the quiet, steady heartbeat of the child between them. But life often strikes hardest when the ground finally feels steady under your feet. And then came the moment no parent is built to survive, the sudden loss of their daughter in a car accident. One call, one breath, one shattering in a line drawn straight through their lives, before and after. The house that had once echoed with their daughter's laughter suddenly fell into a silence so deep it felt alive. It was as if even the walls understood that something irreplaceable had been taken from them. Days became long and heavy, nights felt darker than they had ever known, and grief settled into the quiet spaces between their breaths, into the pauses, the stillness, the moments where words failed. And yet, in the middle of a pain that could have broken them clean in half, they made a choice that felt almost impossible. They did not drift apart. They turned toward each other. They held on when letting go might have been easier. They clung to the scraps of strength they still had, refusing to let the tragedy take the last fragile pieces of their family. What they faced would have crushed many others.
But somehow, through tears and trembling, they stayed.
In a rare moment of honesty years later, George would say, "She saved me more times than she'll ever know." Inside that one quiet sentence lived every morning. Norma helped him stand when he didn't think he could. Every night, she refused to let their world collapse under the weight of sorrow. She became the steady backbone of their survival, the gentle force pushing them forward when grief pulled at their heels. And even as success swept George from small stages to arenas that roared his name, Norma's burden did not vanish. It simply changed shape. Fame has a way of stealing a man from his own dinner table, and George was no exception. While tour buses rumbled down highways far from home, Norma held everything together with a silent, unwavering grace. She became the anchor behind all the noise, the one paying the bills in a quiet kitchen, the one keeping holidays warm and whole even when George came home, too exhausted for more than a smile. She raised Bubba with patience, with steadiness, through seasons where George couldn't fully see the cost she was carrying. Their marriage saw sharp words born from distance and tiredness. But it also saw mornings where they sat across from each other with coffee steaming gently between their hands. Mornings where silence felt soft, not heavy. They were never perfect. They were never polished. And that realness held them together. But life hadn't finished testing them. Storms still gathered on the horizon. As George grew older and the years on the road carved pain into his spine, Norma found herself carrying a new kind of fear, one that settled quietly in the corners of her heart. He watched the man she loved fight his way through life's hardest moments, wounded in ways the world could not see. He learned to pull back, to protect himself by slipping into silence. And then, in 2025, life delivered a different kind of blow. A legal dispute, private, complicated, and painfully public, surfaced involving their son Bubba and his wife, Tamara. More than $100,000 tied to a home renovation disagreement suddenly turned into headlines that moved faster than the truth ever could. Those stories spread like wildfire, reshaping reality into something colder and more dramatic than the situation deserved. Yet George never lashed out. He never defended himself with anger, never stepped in front of his son's struggle to shield him. He simply remained steady. As a father who believes every person must weather their own storms, he stood back, not out of indifference, but out of the deep conviction that strength is learned, not handed down. A longtime friend put it best. That's how he was raised, and that's how he raises his own. With quiet strength, steady hands, and the belief that courage is built in the hard moments. Through young love and empty wallets, through long-distance years that tested them to their core, through heartbreak that could have splintered an entire lifetime, they held on. Through fame that tried to pull them apart, and through storms that returned long after they had earned their rest. And one truth never wavered. Norma was the quiet anchor behind the man the world would one day call a king. Their marriage was not perfect, not polished, not a fairy tale. Not a fairy tale. But it persevered. And sometimes the greatest love story isn't the one untouched by hardship. It's the one where two people choose, again and again, to stand together, facing every dark sky without letting go of each other's hands. Life can be cruel in the way it pretends to be gentle. Jennifer Lynn Strait, just 13 years old, the bright spark who brought laughter into every corner of their home, left for what should have been a simple, ordinary evening with friends. Earlier that day, she was glowing with excitement, promising, "It'll be a short ride. Mom, I'll be back soon." From another room, George called out, "Be careful, Jen." And she smiled, that sweet, reassuring smile every parent tucks away in their memory forever, never imagining it might be the last time they would see. And none of them, not her mother standing in the doorway, not her father listening to her voice drift through the house, not even Jennifer herself, knew the unthinkable truth hidden inside that ordinary moment. That smile would be her last. Those footsteps would never echo down the hallway again. That soft click of the front door wasn't just closing on a simple evening out, it was closing on their life as a whole, unbroken family. No one knew she was walking toward a night she would never return from. No one knew their daughter, full of light and promise, would not come back home again. Somewhere along that familiar Texas road, the world changed in the span of a single heartbeat. The car moved faster than a young driver was prepared to handle. A curve tightened unexpectedly. Nerves and inexperience collided. Control slipped through his hands like sand. Tires scraped the pavement in a desperate attempt to hold on. And then, in one merciless instant, fate delivered a blow from which no one could recover. The crash didn't come with cinematic chaos. No flames, no spectacle, just the cold, devastating silence that follows an impact so final, so cruel, it steals breath before a scream can form. Jennifer was gone before help could ever reach her. Her friends survived, injured and trembling, their young hearts shattered. Their lives, too, were split forever into a before and after. And the young driver, the one who had simply wanted to give his friends a ride, fell into a grief no words could ease. Devastated, shaking, barely able to speak, he faced an investigation that ended with a painful but honest conclusion. It was a tragic accident, born from youth, from fear. From a moment that spun out of control, not from carelessness and not from any intentional wrongdoing. No criminal charges were filed, but guilt, the heavy kind that settles deep into a soul and refuses to loosen its grip, followed him for years, long after headlines faded, long after the world moved on. For George and Norma, the nightmare didn't begin with flashing lights or sirens. It began with a phone call, the kind no parent is ever prepared to receive. The phone rang once, sharp and urgent, cutting through the calm of their home like a blade. George answered, expecting something simple. A neighbor, a friend, maybe even Jennifer herself calling to say she'd be home a little late. Instead, a trembling voice delivered words that stopped his world cold. His breath stopped as if the world had reached out and squeezed it from his chest. His fingers clamped around the phones so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Across the room, Norma watched the color drain from his face, not gradually, but instantly, like life itself had been pulled out of him. Her knees faltered before he even managed to speak. George, what is it?" she whispered, though somewhere deep inside, in the place a mother's instincts live, she already felt the truth clawing its way toward her. The drive to the hospital unfolded like a nightmare behind glass, shaking hands gripping the wheel, headlights stretching across the dark Texas roads, the world rushing past while time somehow stood still. They didn't speak. They couldn't. Every mile stolen from them, another piece of hope they tried desperately to hold on to. And then, at the far end of a cold, sterile hallway, a doctor stepped forward, his eyes lowered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. Your daughter didn't survive. The world didn't spin. It didn't erupt in sound. It simply collapsed, quietly, brutally, folding inward until even breathing felt like too much to ask of a heart already shattered." The days that followed barely existed. Jennifer's bedroom door stayed closed, not out of denial, but because opening it meant facing the unbearable truth that her laughter, her footsteps, her light were gone. Inside, her favorite book still lay open on her nightstand. A jacket hung over the back of her chair, waiting for a day she would never see, and the faint scent of her shampoo clung to the air, a fragile memory refusing to disappear. Norma moved through the house like a ghost, her fingertips grazing her daughter's belongings with the gentlest touch. as though afraid they might vanish beneath her trembling hand. Bubba walked softly, every footstep softened by instinct, his young heart trying, in the only way he knew how, not to deepen the cracks already tearing through his parents' souls. A funeral isn't supposed to feel like the end of the world. But theirs did. The morning of Jennifer's farewell arrived heavy, as if even the sky refused to rise. The cold wind pressed against them with a sharpness that felt almost personal, as though the earth itself understood what had been taken from the Strait family. Dozens gathered. But for George and Norma, the world shrank to the size of one small, heartbreakingly small, casket. George stood shaking, holding his Stetson against his chest, the way a man might hold the pieces of his own fragile heart. Norma leaned into him, her fingers trembling like thin glass ready to fracture, her breath unsteady, her eyes locked on the place no mother should ever have to stand. The pastor's words drifted into the cold morning air, soft, comforting, but distant. They barely touched George because the only sound that truly reached him was the quiet, devastating thud of earth falling onto the casket. That sound, small, final, merciless, etched itself into his soul, a sound he would carry with him for the rest of his life. When the moment came to walk away, Norma could not move at first. She placed her hand gently on the casket, her palm trembling, and whispered a promise only a mother can whisper. A final goodbye no parents should ever have to speak. And then came the cruelest truth of all. The world kept moving. Deadlines didn't pause. Contracts didn't wait. Stages still expected him to return. Night after night, the world demanded the strong, unbreakable George Strait. But only Norma saw what the lights hid. Only she witnessed the nights he sat backstage with his head in his hands, breath shaking, terrified that his voice might shatter beneath the weight of everything he had lost. "I didn't know if I'd ever sing again," he admitted years later. Yet he stepped into the spotlight anyway, not because the pain was gone, but because music became the only place where the grief did not completely suffocate him. It was the one space where he could breathe. Healing didn't come to them in soft waves. It arrived in the smallest, hardest inches, slow, uneven, and unforgiving. They didn't rebuild their lives by letting go of Jennifer. They rebuilt by carrying her with them quietly, faithfully in everything they did. Norma held the family together with a strength so steady and quiet, it didn't need applause to be heroic. She became the anchor when grief threatened to pull them under. George learned how to breathe again, one note at a time, letting music cradle the sorrow he could never fully speak aloud. And Bubba grew into a young man with a tenderness far beyond his years, a child who had learned too early that loss can reshape the way a heart beats. Somewhere along that long, aching journey, a truth settled into the hearts of all who truly knew their story. Life is fragile, love is urgent. And tomorrow is never guaranteed. Jennifer's time on Earth was heartbreakingly brief, but the love she left behind became a thread woven through every chapter that followed. And though the world celebrates George Strait as the king of country music, those who look deeper understand something far more profound. His greatest strength was never just the voice that filled arenas. It was the courage it took to rise again after losing the light that once made his home feel whole. Loss did not approach George gently. It came like a storm without mercy, striking hard and striking fast. Before he even had the chance to stand tall from the last heartbreak life had dealt him. Losing his daughter had already carved a wound so deep that words could never reach the bottom of it. But fate was not finished with him, not yet. It kept coming, blow after blow, stripping away every direction, every comfort, every piece of home he thought he could still lean on. In 2009, the first strike fell. Buddy, the big brother who had stepped in when their mother drifted away, the one who showed George how to carry the weight of ranch life without complaint, was suddenly gone. This was the brother who hoisted him onto horses long before his legs were strong enough to climb, who understood every unspoken ache and every quiet shadow of his childhood. Buddy collapsed without warning, taken by a heart condition no one knew had been silently waiting inside him. 58 years old, far too young, far too soon, far too needed. George was in a studio in Nashville when the phone rang. One moment, the soft hum of guitars filled the room. The next, the world shifted under his feet as a trembling voice delivered news that stole the air from his lungs. He reached for the wall to steady himself, unable to form a word. As if someone had reached straight into his chest, and crushed its very scent. At the funeral, the Texas wind cut through the crowd like a cold blade. Sharp, uncaring, carrying faint echoes of the days they spent working the ranch together. He could almost hear Buddy's voice, teasing him, grounding him, reminding him, don't forget where you came from, little brother. Now that voice lived only in memory. Standing over the casket, George felt something inside him flicker and go dark. Because losing Buddy wasn't just losing a brother, it was losing the guardian of his earliest truths, the one person who knew the boy he once was before the world ever asked him to become anything else. No stage, no audience, no world had ever witnessed a loss like this. One that didn't just break a heart, but unraveled the very map of where a life began. Losing Buddy felt like watching a road vanish in front of him, a road that only the two of them truly understood. And in the hollow ache that followed, George learned something harsh, something unforgettable. Sometimes the people who shape us don't do it with speeches or grand lessons. They shape us simply by standing close enough, long enough for us to grow beside them. Buddy had been that steady presence, quiet, grounded, unshakable. And now he existed only in memory, leaving George to walk forward without the brother who had always believed he would go farther than he ever dreamed. But before George could gather his breath, before grief could even settle, the storm turned again. Faster, darker, more personal than anything he had braced for. Barely a year after losing Buddy in 2010, his mother Doris, the woman whose absence had drawn a permanent silence across his childhood, began to fade under the weight of a long, unforgiving illness. The kind that steals strength inch by inch, day after day, with no mercy and no pause. The woman who once felt unreachable to a small boy, aching for her love, was now fragile, lying beneath thin hospital blankets, fighting for each breath with a patience that broke him. George visited her as often as life would allow, sitting beside her bed in a quiet that cut deeper than any words ever could. Sometimes she reached out with a trembling hand, and the softness of her touch cracked something open in him. In him, a touch that felt like apology and farewell at the same time. Other moments, drifting between awareness and confusion, she whispered fragments of memories long buried. The smell of horses after a Texas rain, the way little George would tug gently at her clothes when fear crept in, the lullabies she used to hum before the world pulled her away. They were tiny pieces of a past he never fully understood, now handed back to him in whispers just as time was running out. Their shared history had never been simple. It was tangled, marked by long silences, by miles that stretched between them, and by choices that left bruises time never fully erased. Yet, in those final days, something unexpected began to shift. The sharp edges softened. The distance that once felt impossible to cross grew thinner, as if life itself was gently urging them toward a quiet reconciliation. One afternoon, when the room was dim and her breaths were growing faint, George reached for her hand, the same hand he had clung to as a child. His voice trembled, barely more than a breath, as he whispered, "I forgive you, Mom. It wasn't meant for anyone else. It wasn't a moment crafted for sentiment or spectacle. It was simply the truth of a son finally seeing the human being behind the mother he had struggled to understand all his life." She squeezed his fingers, weak but steady, full of unspoken words. In that small gesture, they came as close as they ever would to rewriting what had already been lived. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't enough to heal every old wound, but it was real. And sometimes real is all a heart has left to give. When Doris finally drifted into her last quiet moment, fading like a candle that had burned longer than it should have, the grief hit George from every direction at once. He mourned the woman he lost, the childhood he longed for, and the tenderness they discovered only when their time together was slipping away. It was a layered kind of sorrow, grieving not only her absence, but the years that vanished with her, the conversations that would never be finished, the love they found only at the edge of goodbye. And when George stepped out of the hospital into the cold air of 2010, one truth settled deep within him. Forgiveness doesn't rewrite the past. It doesn't erase what was done or what was missed, but it loosens the chains a person carries for far too long. His mother's passing didn't give him neat, polished closure, yet it offered him something quieter, something steadier. A beginning disguised as an ending. It gave him clarity, quiet, steady, undeniable. And in that clarity, George Strait finally allowed himself to love the woman he had spent a lifetime trying to understand. It wasn't the loud, triumphant love people write songs about. It was softer, older, shaped by wounds that had finally stopped bleeding. For the first time, he felt the weight in his chest loosen. But just as grief was settling into a shape he could almost carry, life delivered a blow he never saw coming. In 2013, the last pillar of his world, the final steady presence he had always leaned on, began to fade. His father, John Byron Strait, Sr., the man who held their fragile family together when everything else seemed to fall apart, began a sudden and heartbreaking decline. After years of battling quiet health struggles without complaint, his strength slipped away almost overnight. The man who once worked sunup to sundown without asking for praise, who taught George how to push through pain with dignity, began to weaken in ways that terrified his sons. The hospital became George's second home. Night after night, he sat in that dimly lit room, the glow of the monitors casting pale shadows on a life slowly dimming. Sometimes, his father stirred long enough to take his hand. The grip was faint now, nothing like the firm, reassuring hold George had known his whole life, but the meaning behind it was unchanged. Other nights, John drifted in and out of awareness, slipping further from a world he had spent decades holding steady for everyone else. One storm-heavy evening, rain tapped softly against the window, sounding like a slow, inevitable farewell. George leaned close, his voice cracking as he whispered, "You did good, Dad. You carried us through everything." His father's eyes opened, tired, gentle, filled with a pride that needed no words. For the briefest moment, time paused. Father and son met in that fragile space between memory and goodbye, where love speaks louder than anything else. It was the last moment of clarity they would ever share. When John finally slipped away, the grief didn't roar. It didn't burst. It settled on George like a sudden, crushing weight. He stepped into the hallway, leaning against the cool wall as if the entire building had shifted beneath him. Because in many ways, it had. The man who had been his compass, his anchor, his steady ground, was gone. Losing his daughter had torn a hole in his heart that would never fully close. Losing Buddy had shattered the map of his childhood, scattering the pieces where he could never gather them all again. Losing his mother reopened old wounds he thought time had quietly buried. But losing his father, his last steady route back to where he came from, the final living link to the foundation of his life, was different. It was the moment the world itself changed shape beneath his feet. It was the moment a man who had stood unshaken before millions finally understood a truth. No one escapes. Even legends, even those we call kings, eventually become orphans. And in the middle of that collapse, something fierce and painfully clear rose within him. The kind of clarity only a man who has endured loss after loss can ever truly know. To the outside world, the years that followed painted a different picture entirely. Crowds saw George Strait bathed in blinding arena lights, heard the unmistakable strength in his voice, watched him command stages with the ease of a man born to perform. They saw the icon, the star, the unbreakable figure. But what they didn't see were the shadows that followed him onto every stage. They didn't witness the quiet nights in lonely hotel rooms where he would glance at an empty chair. The same kind of chair his father once filled during rehearsals, offering a simple nod that spoke louder than applause ever could. They didn't see the moment just before he walked into the spotlight, when he paused, letting the memories of Buddy, his mother, and his father settle inside him. Not as pain he carried unwillingly, but as love he carried deliberately. Each loss had carved him deeper, had reshaped him into a man both stronger and more human, more grounded, more vulnerable, more aware of the fragility inside every heartbeat. And somewhere along those endless highways, between late-night flights, early morning sound checks, and the silent stretches of road where the world slept but grief stayed awake, a truth began to take root. A truth with enough weight to change the direction of a man's life. Time is not a promise. It is a gift, offered once, and never guaranteed again. The people who shape us, the ones who raise us, guide us, forgive us, teach us, and believe in us, are never guaranteed. They are not landmarks that stand forever. They are moments, precious, delicate, and irreplaceable. And with every passing year, George Strait came to understand something many people realize far too late. Forgiveness postponed is forgiveness that may never be spoken. Love left unsaid is love that may never reach the hearts it was meant for. He learned that the gentle miracles of everyday life, a father's steady presence, a brother's laughter, a mother's touch, can disappear without a whisper, leaving only the aching echo of words we thought we had more time to say. Yet through every storm, every loss, every fracture to his spirit, George continued to rise, not because he was untouched by grief, and not because he was made of iron, but because he refused to let tragedy harden who he was. He carried his scars the way a soldier carries medals, not as symbols of pain, but as living reminders of the people who built him, loved him, and shaped the man he became. And that is what separates George Strait from the myth that surrounds him. Beyond the awards, beyond the sold-out arenas, beyond the legend of the King of Country, stands something far more extraordinary. A man who kept standing after fate took nearly everyone who once helped him stand. A man who walked forward with a softer heart, urging the rest of us, by his example, to hold our loved ones a little tighter while they are still here to feel it. But life has a cruel way of shifting battle. Once a man survives heartbreak that should have destroyed him, fate sometimes turns its next strike inward. Instead of taking the people around him, it threatens the man himself. His strength, his body, his endurance. For George Strait, now entering his late 50s and early 60s, the decade after losing so many of the people who shaped him brought an entirely new kind of storm. This one didn't announce itself with drama. It didn't arrive with alarms or warnings. It crept in quiet. At first, it looked like nothing more than ordinary exhaustion, a scratch in the throat after a long performance, a tightening in his chest during rehearsals, a stubborn ache in his back that lingered just a little longer each month. Signs small enough to brush aside. And, at first, he did talk. He waved it off with the quiet confidence of a man who had survived far worse. He had always kept moving, always kept going. Why would this be any different? Just tired, he told Norma with a soft, practiced smile. But she knew him too well to believe it. She saw the small things he tried to hide, the way his fingers paused at his throat after every show, as if checking whether his voice was still there. The tiny wince when he bent to pull on his boots. The nights when he curled toward the edge of the bed, because lying flat sent a streak of pain shooting down his spine like a warning, he didn't want to acknowledge. George Strait had spent a lifetime pushing through hurt without a word of complaint. But this time, the pain refused to step aside. It demanded to be noticed. The first real blow came around 2011, when a severe throat infection gripped the very instrument that had carried him through decades of heartbreak, triumph, and endurance. During rehearsal, his voice cracked, first just a thin break, then a collapse that left only a rough rasp hanging in the air. And in that moment, fear hit him in a way no personal tragedy ever had. At age 59, the doctor looked him in the eye and delivered a warning harsher than anything a critic or audience could say. "If you push this, George, you may not get it back." The words struck him like shrapnel. Canceling shows felt like betrayal of his fans, of his crew, and of the tireless work ethic his father had built into his bones. But the worst fear was the one he finally confessed to Norma late one night, the room dark enough that he didn't have to hide. "What if this is how it ends?" he whispered. Norma placed her hand over his heart, feeling the tremble beneath her palm. "Then we fight," she said softly. "We fight like we always have, together." And he fought. Steam inhalers, strict vocal rest, shows postponed that tore at him more than any critic's review. Night after night spent in silence, waiting, hoping when his voice finally returned, it wasn't the same. It was deeper, worn, textured, carrying a tenderness only he could truly hear. But that tenderness made it more human, more weathered, more sincere. It carried the sound of a man who had lived every note he sang, yet nothing, not grief, not illness, not lost years, could prepare him for the next storm. The storm that struck his back, his spine, his ability to stand tall at all. By 2014, as he approached 70, decades of horseback riding, endless pacing across arena stages, long stretches of travel, and the quiet tension he carried through every chapter of his life began carving merciless lines of pain down his body. Pain that no spotlight could disguise. Pain that followed him into the morning and refused to leave at night. It struck without warning. One moment, he was simply bending forward, tying a boot like he had done 1,000 mornings before. And then, a sharp, blinding jolt ripped through him. His strength vanished so quickly, it felt stolen. A rush of burning numbness spread across his lower back, leaving him frozen between breaths, unsure if he could move at all. There were mornings when he couldn't stand upright, no matter how many times he tried. Nights when Norma had to slip her shoulder beneath his arm and lift him inch by inch from the mattress, steadying the man who had spent a lifetime holding everyone else up. Huh. Backstage before shows, he gripped the countertop until his knuckles turned white, waiting for that electric pain to fade just enough so he could walk out beneath the lights and give people the performance they'd come to see. Doctors used words like inflammation, nerve compression, wear and tear, the slow, relentless weight of time, the kind of words heavier than any arena he'd ever filled. And between 2018 and 2025, show after show had to be postponed or canceled, each one cutting deeper than the public ever knew. Behind closed doors, the toll was real. Sometimes Bubba would slip quietly into the room, place steady hands on his father's shoulders, and whisper, "Dad, it's all right. You're allowed to rest. You've carried enough." But George, built on decades of discipline and pride, pushed through the pain far more than he ever should have. "I hate feeling weak," he confessed to Norma once, voice trembling in a way he tried to hide. She held his face gently, looked him in the eyes, and said, "This isn't weakness, isn't weakness. This is strength, enduring pain you never deserved." And through every setback, the burning throat, the aching back, the stiff joints, the nights when even lifting a guitar felt impossible, George kept finding ways to stand. And when he truly couldn't, the people who loved him stood tall beside him. Norma became his quiet guardian, the healer who never asked for recognition. At dawn, she warmed towels for his throat. She rubbed ointment into the deep knots in his back while he clenched his jaw to keep from groaning. On the hardest nights, she sat behind him, her hand resting gently over his chest, counting his breaths to calm him through the waves of pain. Sometimes, she whispered memories to anchor him, soft reminders of the life they built. "Remember how Jen used to jump on your shoulders before breakfast?" She'd say, and in those moments the past didn't hurt him. It carried him forward. Bubba, now a grown man with a quiet strength of his own, stepped naturally into the role of protector. Before each show, when George's hands trembled too much to buckle his belt, Bubba would kneel beside him and secure it with steady fingers, offering a reassuring nod instead of pity. After the crowds thundered their applause and the lights faded, he would check on him with the same gentle question every time. "Still with me, Dad?" In those moments of exhaustion, when the world finally went silent, George would close his eyes and breathe out the words that kept him going. "They didn't give up on me, so I can't give up on myself." The echoes of his father, his brother, and his daughter were never ghosts. They were the reasons he kept fighting. They formed the spine of his resilience, the unbroken thread running through every hardship. And slowly, with the stubborn will that had defined him since boyhood, George began to rise again. His body didn't return to what it once was, but it found a new pace, a new balance. He learned, sometimes the hard way, that rest is not weakness, but wisdom. That survival is not about pretending you're unbreakable, but about knowing when to hold on and when to lean on those who love you. Age, he discovered, isn't defeat. It's a badge earned through every trial, every scar, every battle a man endures and overcomes. His voice returned, richer and deeper, carrying not just melody, but the weight of time and truth. His back steadied enough for him to step beneath the bright lights again, not as the man he once was, but as the man life had shaped him into. And in those years, his 70s, the decade marked by loss, recovery, and grit, George Strait became something greater than the king of country music. He became living proof of a truth every older heart understands, even if they rarely say it aloud. Time bends us. Pain humbles us. Illness challenges us. But none of it can break us if we rise each day with the strength we have and let the people who love us help carry the weight. Because true strength isn't the absence of hurt. It's the courage to keep standing and the grace to let others lift you when you can't. Now, at 73, George Strait stands not only as a musical icon, but as one of the most quietly remarkable self-made success stories in American entertainment. His estimated net worth, now nearing $300 million, feels almost unreal when compared to the memory of a young ranch kid who once counted pennies with Norma just to make it through the week. A boy who grew into a man the world would someday call a legend. His wealth today stands on the shoulders of decades, platinum albums stacked across time, Tours that broke attendance records again and again, catalog royalties that still echo through radio speakers, brand partnerships built with integrity, smart real estate choices, and the steady discipline of a man who has always understood that success is a marathon, not a sprint. But even with all of that, the fortune itself is not the miracle. The miracle is the journey, the unthinkable path that carried him from dusty rodeo arenas and long drives down Texas backroads to a life of abundance he once never thought possible. Success didn't change who he was. It didn't make him louder, prouder, or detached from where he came from. If anything, it made him quieter and more grateful. He knew that every blessing he held in his hands was once just a dream, something he and Norma whispered about when they had nothing but hope to spare. Nowhere is his rise more visible or more deeply felt than in the places he has called home. His real estate legacy stretches across Texas like a living map of his life, each property echoing a chapter of the man he became. At the center of that story stands his once legendary 12.2-acre hilltop estate in San Antonio, a place so astonishing that visitors often pause before speaking, as if words might disturb the beauty around them. Designed and sculpted over 3 patient years by master architect and artisan Bill Tull, the estate rose from the earth like a piece of art. It blended adobe inspirations with hand-carved wooden ceilings, peaceful stone courtyards that warmed in the fading light, and 14 fireplaces that glowed like constellations scattered across a desert night. A private spa wing offered quiet healing, an infinity pool spilled toward miles of rolling Texas hills, and a cliffside patio framed sunsets that looked like they'd been brushed in shades of ember and gold shades. It wasn't just a home, it was a story. His story, etched in stone, flame, and silence. Even after he chose to sell the estate, its legacy remains untouched. It is still remembered as one of the most breathtaking celebrity homes ever to grace Texas soil. Today, George divides his time between wide-open ranch land, a peaceful lake retreat, and several discrete properties tucked quietly across the state. These places aren't monuments to wealth, they're sanctuaries. Safe havens where the noise falls away, where the man behind the legend can breathe, heal, and simply exist as George, the husband, the father, the Texan, not just the icon. Long fences stretch out toward the horizon, disappearing into that soft Texas haze. Horses graze lazily under the sun, porch boards creak with the familiar weight of time, and the shadows of old oak trees drift slowly across the grass like memories passing quietly by. This is the kind of wealth that doesn't brag. It doesn't shimmer or shout. It simply breathes. It lives. His assets reach far beyond land and property. They form a world built on craftsmanship, heritage, and the kind of intentional choices made by a man who values stories more than status. George has always loved machines with soul. Classic Chevrolets restored with precision. Custom Western-inspired pickups tailored to his taste, work trucks weathered by real dirt and real miles. Vehicles that tell the truth about where he's been and the life he's lived. His watches are much the same. Rugged Western chronographs, understated luxury pieces, and a handful of Swiss timepieces gifted during milestone tours. But the true crown jewel of his private world is not parked in a garage or resting in a velvet-lined box. It's the open sky. A licensed pilot for decades, George has owned and flown several aircraft, most notably the Gulfstream G450, a long-range jet capable of crossing continents with smooth, effortless grace. To outsiders, it may look like extravagance, but to George, it's something far more meaningful. A lifeline. A way to finish a show and still make it home to Norma that very night. A way to keep fame from stealing the hours that matter most. His planes, his trucks, his watches, none of them are trophies. They're mile markers, reminders of every road he had to survive to build the life he now protects so fiercely. Today, his personal world is anchored not by fame, but by steadiness. By roots. Bubba, now a father himself, a respected songwriter, and a seasoned rodeo competitor, has become a guardian of the family legacy, carrying forward the values he was raised with. Family gatherings remain simple and warm, untouched by the pressures of celebrity. Kids racing down hallways, fishing lines, casting gently into quiet lakes, the smell of grilled suppers, drifting across wide porches as the sun sinks low. These are the moments George treasures more than any chart record or award. In recent years, he has spoken candidly about his estate plans. His intention is clear: to leave behind not just financial security, but guidance, and to pass on trust structures designed to protect his children's futures and to preserve the values he believes are sacred: humility, responsibility, faith, and devotion to family. And through it all, his philanthropy remains immense, but intentionally humble. For decades, through the Jennifer Strait Memorial Foundation, he has supported children's charities with quiet generosity. Millions of dollars have been given to medical programs, shelters, educational initiatives, and organizations offering hope to families in crisis. He never asks for recognition. He simply gives, because giving is part of the way he honors the daughter he lost and the people he hopes to help in her name. He continues to support military charities, disaster relief efforts, and community projects across Texas with the same quiet consistency he brings to every part of his life. For George Strait, generosity has never been a spotlight moment. It has never been a gesture performed for applause. It is simply woven into who he is, shaped by hardship, strengthened by faith, and guided by the belief that a man should leave the world better than he found it. And now, in these later years so soft, so hard-won, George Strait has stepped into a chapter defined not by stadium crowds, but by peace. He still saddles up when his back allows, taking slow, easy rides across land that has carried generations. On tougher days, he walks gently, taking his time, refusing to rush the life he fought so hard to keep. His home is quiet now, a sanctuary filled with photographs, some framed proudly, some tucked in drawers like private treasures. Faces he loves. Faces he misses, moments frozen in time that shaped him into the man the world would come to admire. When he reflects now, his thoughts have the calm weight of someone who has lived the full arc of life. The rising, the breaking, the rebuilding, and the grace that waits patiently on the other side. And if there is one truth that crowns his legacy, one truth bigger than the records, the awards, the sold-out arenas, it is this: greatness is not measured by the noise a man makes, but by the light he leaves in the hearts of those who walk beside him. George Strait's story is not just the story of a country music icon. It is the story of a man who carried mountains, who survived storms, who held on to love through every chapter, and who learned slowly, humbly, that real strength comes from allowing others to lift you when you can no longer lift yourself. Thank you for walking this journey with us, step by step, memory by memory, moment by moment. May the life of George Strait remind you that resilience is quiet, love is steady, and grace is something earned over a lifetime. From all of us at Golden American Stars, may your life be filled with peace, strength, and unwavering love. May your home stay warm, your relationships grounded and steady, and your days filled with a happiness deeper than anything money can buy. May you and everyone you hold dear walk into the future with protection, health, unity, and a bond that only grows stronger with each passing year. Thank you for watching, and may your heart carry every blessing it can hold.